in cyberspace, space, and in other domains. The particular focus of the report, obviously, as the name says, is catalyzing NATO's performance through innovation. So the focus is on innovation. And I would say that overall, this report is descriptive, prescriptive, but also constructive. I think we go, in spite of the fact that it's not a really long report, but nevertheless we go into very specific examples on how we can bridge the current capabilities of what NATO does in terms of innovation and technological development and the future needs and how to balance that. Of course, the geopolitical context very much defined our work. And we've said so many times that the world is at a critical geostrategic inflection point. After Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which happened towards the end of writing of the report, we did indeed find ourselves facing a new situation because Russia's aggression has created a new security reality that will be defining the security environment for the years to come. And we have seen a breach of international law postulates, but also a return to the traditional territorial conquest, which could set precedents in other parts of the world in terms of trying to change borders by force around the world. So when looking at the environment that NATO finds itself in, we outlined, first of all, as I said, the geopolitical context, the 21st century, the fact that the rise of China and the shift of geopolitical power towards the east has been one of the most dominant characters or factors of the 21st century. So obviously the next strategic concept will look at the relationship with China, whom NATO does not perceive as an adversary, but certainly as a challenge. And there is a lot of work to be done in many domains, from systemic competition in terms of values and rules-based society, to regulating the space of emerging, connecting and disruptive technologies, and in particular artificial intelligence. So we've looked at, in particular, the three forces that determine NATO's external environment. And one is the intensifying systemic competition, where we see not just the ideas of liberal democracy versus the ideas of autocracies, the ideas questioning market economies and personal liberties. But we actually see fissures within the system where it has become quite difficult to identify blocks of aligned nations. And in this systemic fight for resources, for ideas, and for values, which is happening now, we've determined that the liberal aligned nations, rather than the Western democracies, have to stand together, which means that for NATO and the European Union, it means more unity in face of not just Russia's aggression, but any type of violation of international law and rules-based order around the world. The second aspect is the rise of geoeconomics, and we will be talking about that a lot today, I believe, and that is certainly the projection of economic power within and across the domains of land, sea, air, space, cyberspace, and other domains to achieve political goals. And it makes connectivity just as important as territoriality. We see that even on our own continent, in the European Union, on this side of the transatlantic alliance, but we also see that in lots of parts of the world, where with the combined power and combined work of authoritarian powers questioning rules-based international order and liberal democratic systems with their own value systems in trying to swing the pendulum towards the kind of ideas that would undermine our own societies. We've also talked about the threats that have arisen in the 21st century from almost now traditional threats of terrorism and proliferation of weapons to other threats that pertain to cybersecurity, which for our citizens and for our economies is of incredible importance. Energy security, obviously, but also the security of infrastructure, the security of supply chains will be of utmost importance in the time that is ahead of us. Thirdly, we looked at the divergence of priorities among allies. And this is something that, you know, with Russia's invasion against Ukraine, it's been a wake-up call for most countries. And we have realized that not only do we have to stand together, but we also need to invest into defense a lot more. And I always talk about defense investment rather than defense spending. Now, the issue is how we will spend the money, how the defense investment will be defined by nations, by NATO nations, but also by alliances as such. And we looked at ways where we can provide guidance to those who look at innovation from different points of view. From my personal experience, when it comes to defining priorities, sometimes it does not really depend on synergy between the threats and the needs and the capabilities and the need for new capabilities, but it sometimes depends on political associations and alliances rather than on clear thinking of how we need to go forward. So innovation obviously is the path ahead for NATO, meaningful, purposeful innovation, defining on what kind of innovation we need and how we are going to achieve it in fostering this ecosystem between our governments and the structures within national governments and NATO, and with innovators, with the businesses, with the defense industry, but also with our partners, how to achieve synergy between NATO and the EU capabilities, and how to include other types of investment rather than just EU and NATO, how to foster forward resilience by working with our partners around the globe, around the world. And in order to achieve all this, we have given a number of recommendations. And I will not go into detail at this point. I will be happy to respond to any questions as my colleagues will delve more into the depth of the report. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Indeed, now the conclusions are going to be presented by Heiko Borchert. Heiko, would you like to give us the gist of the report, please?
Yes, with pleasure, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. It's really great to have you here. I think it's an important point in time to discuss about what kind of approach NATO will need to really drive innovation towards the future battlefield. But let me perhaps start by picking up one line that Kolinda talked about, the rise of geoeconomics. In the end, our report is a report about preparing NATO for geoeconomic competition. NATO may be well versed in dealing with geopolitical challenges, but we fundamentally believe that geoeconomics creates a new Achilles heel for the alliance. Why is that? I think we all know that military capabilities depend on various different building blocks. One building block is technology. Technology is being developed by industry, but over the last, let's say, 10, 15 years, we have all accustomed to say, cooperating with traditional defense suppliers it's about supply chains, it's about access to technology, access to markets, and even access to supply chains. So the more we want NATO to reach out to non-traditional defense players, the more we force NATO into this geoeconomic Achilles heel. So in a way, when you look back at the last 2 years and all that COVID vocabulary now, what NATO needs right now is a kind of geoeconomic vaccination. We might be talking already about improving NATO's defense capabilities, but what we say is you need a different approach to withstand geoeconomic competition in the 21st century. And this starts with your mindset. Innovation occurs in a triangle that constitutes of risk, performance, and conformance. Our Western problem these days is that we are all avoiding risks. But the problem is, the more risk-aware you are as a deterrer, the more risk-willing your challenger is going to be. We don't need to talk about ongoing conflicts, but part of our risk aversion is the result we are seeing these days. So what our central message is that this triangle that has been emphasizing conformance to the extent that we really no longer engage on any risky business needs to be redrawn. We need to refocus this triangle in order to ignite NATO's performance to become more risk-daring. And this is where the 5-point adaptive portfolio unfolds, where we make suggestions on how NATO can achieve this transformation. First of all, we argue that economic security needs to be the basis of NATO innovation. Economic security boils down to various different recommendations. I would just like to mention 2. First of all, and I think this is really important to talk about this in Brussels because this is where the Commission comes in, we have an ongoing discussion about social taxonomy, we have an ongoing discussion about ESG, and we have that increasingly problematic situation that under today's ESG discussion, the defense industry becomes an uninvestable asset class. This is a fundamental problem for NATO because as we speak, NATO has launched its innovation fund, and NATO wants to use money from the innovation fund to invest in companies. But if ESG means that defense is non-investable, having NATO as an investor will not attract co-investors. It will deter co-investors. So if NATO wants to make a difference with its innovation fund, NATO and the Commission will need to talk about this ESG issue. The second aspect we say when we talk about making economic security the basis of NATO innovation is NATO needs an economic security agenda. The issue has been lingering in the North Atlantic Charter since 1949 with Article 5. But nobody really picked up this idea on economic cooperation inside NATO because we had the European Union, we had the European Commission. But in a geoeconomic context, we need to have a defense look on issues like foreign direct investment and its impact on the defense industrial base. We need to talk about supply chain issues when cooperating with non-European partners. You need to talk about the availability of your critical technology in Europe, always bearing in mind that we don't have a collective industrial base. We only have individual national industrial bases. So we are going to have an eternal tension between collective sovereign technologies and national sovereign technologies. And NATO needs to grapple with that issue. Second recommendation, NATO needs to be extremely precise, as you said, on what kind of information and innovation NATO needs, because, sorry for my French, but there has been too much hype about innovation over here, over there. I sometimes wonder if innovation is the solution, what exactly is the problem we're trying to solve? Nobody answers that problem. Nobody answers that question. So in our report, we clearly say NATO innovation should be driven towards making NATO more daring, enable NATO to take more risk, and also prepare NATO to operate in an environment where we no longer call the shots. You're all familiar with that age-old discussion about anti-access area denial capabilities, where the enemy all of a sudden forces you to behave according to his rules. But if we still want to make sure that our way of living and our values prevail, we will need to prepare NATO and NATO's innovation projects for this A2AD environment. The third recommendation we make is a recommendation about making the NATO innovation ecosystem resilient. Resilience has many different meanings to many different stakeholders. What we say first is NATO needs a defense industrial policy. NATO doesn't have a defense industrial policy, but the problem is the more you tap into non-commercial partners, the more you ask digital companies to support NATO, the more you bring different paradigms, different business models, different business rationales to the table. And they all operate along also different product life cycles. So you need to get a joint understanding of where you want your defense industrial base to head to in the future. And by the way, you also need to clarify what is a defense industrial base in the future. So that's a very important element of making the NATO innovation system resilient. And we also say, of course, there is this other organization in Brussels with the European Commission and the EUMS and European Defense Agency, and they all engage on defense innovation as well. So the question is, how will NATO and the European Union go together in order to strengthen collective defense innovation? And we say there may be different opportunities to look at. Certainly one really low-hanging fruit is the NATO centers of excellence, which are not really NATO centers, they're national centers assigned to NATO, but they provide concept development, they look into military scenarios, they have an awful lot of military experience. Why not incentivizing NATO nations to make sure that these COEs can work inside consortia that will be sponsored by the European Defence Fund? Very low-hanging fruit. Another low-hanging fruit worth looking into is the question of experimental units. If we say that innovation in the end is about daringness and risk-taking, it also is about accepting failure. And it is also about accepting experimentation. Different NATO/EU nations have military experimentation units. We could use these units in order to mature technology development, in order to put innovation to the front line quickly, and perhaps even fund these military units with NATO and EU money. The fourth recommendation is a recommendation on how to bring defense innovation to the front line much quicker than in the past. One very important element of accelerating the push of defense innovation to the front line, again, where the European Commission and NATO might join forces, is defense sandboxing. Those of you that work on regulatory affairs know about sandboxing, know about the idea of reducing regulatory red tape. In the defense industry, we still have an awful lot of regulatory red tape. And we need to cut down on, for example, limited profit margins, because if you want startups to engage in defense innovation companies and you clearly limit their profit margins from the start, well, it might not be attractive to make a case and convince your investors, I will sell my product in the defense environment. And the final point, and the fifth recommendation, really is about ensuring that defense innovation is not a one-time shot, but rather becomes a sustainable, long-term undertaking. And here we make one specific recommendation and say, if NATO engages in funding defense innovation, NATO should also become an early adopter of the respective solutions. Because this is all about market signals. If you signal to markets that the products you have been funding are ready to be used, you deliver a strong message that also the industry that is behind the products has the respective reliability. You don't need to make a procurement commitment, but you could start with using demonstrators that grow out of NATO innovation projects. That in a nutshell, and you all have to report that in a nutshell, are some of our ideas on how to vaccinate NATO for this upcoming geoeconomic competition. And happy to take any questions later on. Thank you.
There will be. Thank you very much, Heiko. Now, the digital dimension, and we all remember that, just to give you one concrete example, in January when the first cyber attacks came from Russia against Ukraine, it was Microsoft that flagged the attacks, analyzed them, and reported about them on a global scale. So, Casper, Klynge, the floor is yours on the particular digital dimension of what we've been talking about. The floor is yours.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Roland, and great to see all of you here today. Also to be in very good company here in the panel. I have to say one thing though, it doesn't represent the full council, I would say, because a lot of people used to wear uniforms. So in the beginning of the work, I felt a little bit lonely. So it's great to be here with other civilians as well.
Former Commander-in-Chief.
Fair point. But I'm not sure you wore a uniform, but anyway. Yeah, no, but it's been great also to be a representative from the private sector and the work of the Future Security and Defense Council. And I also just want to say thanks to Robert for inviting me in my personal capacity to the work here. I'll try and say a couple of words on why we found the work particularly timely when we initiated this back in August 2021, and perhaps also add a few words on why, in many ways, reality caught up with us, so that if we didn't have this council today, we would certainly have to reinvent it. And I also think that GlobeSec is in a particular situation to actually take this work forward, also because of your geographic location. I think you have been instrumental in actually driving some of these discussions forward as well. I come from a technology company. I used to work in government, and one of the key ambitions that we have is to actually foster a closer dialogue between the private sector and the public sector around the challenges that will be facing us tomorrow. And as I said, I think the work that we've been going through and that Heiko so eloquently gave us the main conclusions from has been incredibly important in highlighting areas where we think NATO have an opportunity today to adapt to a new reality in a new world. And Roland, you mentioned, of course, what all of us are following, every single day, the unjustified and unlawful war in Ukraine. And you're also very generous in calling out that as a company, we came out both before the 24th of February, on the 24th of February, and also subsequently in giving some of the insights that we have in the broader picture around cybersecurity attacks that have been part of the war in Ukraine as well. And I think that shows, if nothing else, also the particular role that we are facing in today's world, where the private sector, like it or not, are also part of the first responders to the kind of situation that we're facing. I think Ukraine is tragic in many, many ways, but if anything, I think it's one of the first wars where you can truly say that this is a hybrid war, perhaps unlike anything we've seen before. We have, of course, the fighting taking place on ground, but what you also saw both in the years leading up to the 24th of February, in the days leading up to the 24th of February, and what has continued after the 24th of February is a continued cybersecurity attack on Ukraine, on Ukrainian authorities, on Ukrainian civil society, on Ukrainian critical infrastructure. Now, our data sets that we have made public as well, including in a report just last week that I can recommend for those of you who haven't seen it, where we go through the threat picture that we've identified, shows both an increase in the number of attacks we've seen. This is not unique for Ukraine, but something we see on a global scale as well. But also, and this is, I think, where there is a specific challenge today, the degree of sophistication and the degree of frequency in cybersecurity attacks, unfortunately, is going up. And whether you sit in Ukraine, whether you sit in Brussels, whether you sit around the world, mitigating the cybersecurity threats in an increasingly digital world is something that we will have to invest in, and actually an area where I think NATO has adapted and continues to focus increasingly on what that means for the technology, supremacy of the alliance. And we can throw a couple of numbers at you lately that we've seen lately, but I think the foundational or the primary aspect of it is that the degree of destructive attacks we've seen on Ukraine has had, a very deliberate part of the warfare that we've seen unfolding. So in many ways, based on what we've seen in Ukraine, one could argue that the work of the Council, the recommendations that Heiko went through, is more timely than ever before. I would also say that certainly in the work that we've been having with NATO over the last couple of years, that discussion on how to make sure that we support NATO in the adaptation to a new digital reality that is also impacting, NATO's threat scenario, that discussion is a little bit easier today, and I think there is a window of opportunity for actually landing some of the recommendations that we've seen in the report that we have in front of us. I think from our point, and one aspect that you also mentioned in your introductory remarks is, of course, that there is in many ways an unprecedented unity inside the European Union, NATO across the Atlantic, in focusing and preparing our institutions for the reality of tomorrow. And I think this is where innovation is such a critical aspect of it. I think what we've seen in the last couple of years is also what I would call the geopolitics of technology, and where you, Heiko, rightly pointed out that even traditional companies that have not been part of the defense industrial space, that we find ourselves increasingly pulled into these discussions, whether it's on artificial intelligence, whether it's on cybersecurity, whether it's on quantum computing. These new technologies that we are part of developing and deploying, they will have an impact not only on the European Union, but definitely also NATO, which is one of the reasons why we think NATO needs to adapt perhaps at a faster pace to the realities that we're seeing. And I think in many ways, as we look towards the Madrid summit, you could say that we are tying together, a process from London to Madrid. What began at the London summit with NATO's focus on emerging and disruptive technologies is now leading NATO to look at a new strategic concept, where I think a lot of us are hopeful that that concept will include an increased focus on how NATO can innovate, but also how NATO can use and utilize emerging and disruptive technologies as well. But I think one important part of the recommendation we put in the report is there is also an opportunity for NATO to play a role in the normative space or in the broader regulatory area. We sit not too far away from the EU institutions here, and it goes without saying that the European Union currently are in the process of creating a wave, or as some might call a tsunami, of regulations that are coming forward in the digital space. We welcome that. We think it's necessary because of the impact that the new technologies will have. But I think, and we think as a council, that there is an opportunity for NATO to move more into the normative space and actually look at the regulatory space along with these new technologies that will have such a huge impact, not only on NATO, but around the world. There is an opportunity for NATO, in concert together with the European Union, to supplement the regulatory agenda that we're seeing coming out of Brussels these years. I think another recommendation that will come as a shocking surprise to you, that we like that recommendation, is to talk about how we bring the private sector and the public sector broader together, closer together on these agendas. And this is definitely an area where we think that the recommendations on creating a high-level dialogue between NATO and the private sector, including the technology industry, is a real opportunity for bringing these discussions not only at the technical level, but actually to the level of the NAC, having a frequent dialogue where you bring in companies to share technology insights, to discuss what NATO expects, in other words, also to hold the companies to account, but also to foster what I would call sort of a slight cultural mindset change to make sure that there is a much closer dialogue between the private sector and the public sector. And I think the point that many of you have made already is that that will also help generate potentially a cultural change within NATO, and potentially also an opportunity for looking at the organizational setup in NATO to again better help NATO remain the alliance, the defense alliance in the 21st century. I think I'll leave it at this here to begin with, and just finish up by saying that the opportunity to create, I would say, a new approach to a reality that we've seen unfolding in the last couple of months is really here today. I think the work of GlobeSec, and in all modesty, the work of the Council has been timely, and it's been pointing to a number of areas that we hope NATO will receive and embrace with open arms, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue with NATO in the next couple of weeks and months. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Casper. Before we move into Q&A, and I also want to give Marcin Zaborowski the opportunity to contribute something. I mean, there's one question that came up listening to all three of you. Now, we all know that the European Union has supranational elements as an organization. We also know that NATO is an intergovernmental organization. And I've heard at several points in these presentations here now a call for NATO to become more proactive, for example, in taking a normative role. Wouldn't that presuppose a role change for NATO, or at least a change of distribution of roles between NATO and its member states? Would NATO take on some kind of new identity vis-a-vis its member states? How do you see this? And then, of course, the other obvious question is the NATO-EU relationship. I'm not going to ask you whether it's good or bad, because that would be letting you off too easily. For whoever it may concern of you, my question is, where do you see the most urgent room for improvement in NATO-EU relations? But maybe first, Casper, can you elaborate on this question of a normative function for NATO as an organization?
It's on. Thanks. You see, I even need some technology advice from Heiko on these issues as well. Thanks. No, listen, I think it's important to say that this is, of course, a set of recommendations that are coming out of the Council. Whether NATO will embrace it or take it forward is I don't think, up for the Council to decide on. What I think we are saying is that in the digital era, in the situation we're finding ourselves in right now, there is a vacuum around looking at the normative discussions, setting standards, including setting standards around technology that are increasingly being used in the broader military space. And I do think that this is an area where NATO has a normative power, depending on whether its member states would like to take this power forward. Again, I don't think that's certainly not for me to have views on, but I do think that both for the private sector and for NATO as an institution, there are some opportunities to help set the playing field, if you like, and also help guide the private sector on how we develop technologies that could find its way into the battle space as well. What is right or wrong? If you look at what the European Union is doing these days, I think, for example, around artificial intelligence, it is basically regulating, high-risk areas versus non-high-risk areas, setting standards that the industry will have to adapt to. And I think that's the right forward. This is for international organizations to govern. It is not for the private sector to govern. And I do think what we are, in a very modest way, putting into the report is that it might also be helpful for the private sector to get a better sense of how we can be helpful in what we do in support of NATO here.
Sorry, just to build on that, I think a very important point is in NATO's taking some part of regulatory role, which so far has been negligible, is for our defense industries to remain and become more investable. And that means that when we look at investment, not just public but private investment, when you define technologies and products, especially dual-use technologies, a lot of investors are weary of investing into products that have the a kind of shady atmosphere around them, that they would be used for solely military purposes, offensive military purposes, etc. So I think this is where NATO can play a much greater role in defining these aspects of products and services that our industry provides, so they don't get investment just from the EU or NATO or the NATO investment fund, but that they can get private investment and investment from third sources as well. And that is to boost defense industries in our countries, which is within the economic policy that we have been talking about.
If I may add, I think it's not really a question of supranationalism versus intergovernmentalism. I mean, NATO has had a regulatory role for decades because standardization is regulation. But the question really is, to what extent is NATO, footnote, whatever NATO is in this very specific case, footnote closed, to what extent is NATO able and willing to make that regulatory voice heard vis-a-vis the Commission, vis-a-vis other standard-setting bodies, when we talk about regulating technology that is at the core of military capabilities? This is what it's all about. If we say you need more non-traditional technologies in order to provide future capabilities, you need to really engage on the regulatory discussion that shapes the availability of that technology. And also on defense industry remaining an investable asset clause. I mean, if you want to attract non-defense companies to the defense market, you need to provide these companies with a business perspective. That is selling products. So NATO will also need to engage on discussions about export licenses, export control, transfer of technology. No? If we would end up funding companies in the NATO ecosystem, but at the same time say, look, we're funding you, but you will not be allowed to share that technology with other nations, well, you effectively close a market. You can do that. But then, of course, you need to scale up your investment. So you need to offer them other market perspective. And I think that's the kind of dialogue NATO needs to engage in, because for the time being, this is mainly a dialogue on the side of the Commission, because this is where, of course, market liberalization inside the Commission comes in. And what we say, and this is also a point that you made, Casper, is that muted regulatory voice of NATO needs to become louder in order to address these issues, irrespective of the question of whether NATO's character changes in becoming into a supranational organization. I really wouldn't mix the two things together.
What I would emphasize here is that actually what you just said, all three of you, is already an answer to my second question, which was about the EU-NATO relationship. And what you are advocating here, in fact, is a more active role in NATO in making its voice heard in the EU regulatory strategy and regulatory policies. And I think that's already one important takeaway of this whole thing. Now, Marcin Zaborowski, have we forgotten something? Which is the point that you would like to emphasize, seeing how instrumental you were in bringing this baby to birth, so to speak?
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor. I don't think we have forgotten anything, really. I mean, I just think that perhaps a few things need to be re-emphasized. You know, the thing that really strikes me about the report, about the work of our group, is this importance of geoeconomics. And maybe I can ask, you know, Heiko and yourself to define it in the way that the audience, everybody's familiar, what exactly do we mean by that? You know, the thing that strikes me when we look into the evolution of NATO and, you know, politics, Western politics relations since the creation of NATO was a kind of a, you know, the NATO emerged as a product of a Cold War but very much this geoeconomics was very much there, was very much in existence. I think following the end of the Cold War, it started to disappear, in a sense. NATO was confined to a military area which started to be disliked. And I think that in the last few years, we see the competitors taking advantage of that fact. And there is a very clear need here for the re-emergence of geoeconomics. I think the Ukraine crisis is making it very clear to ourselves. Whereby, if military dimension on itself, military politics on itself, disassociated from, economics, from innovation, from our aspects of our life, really, this cannot fly. And this creates a situation that defense spending is always pushed away, defense investment is pushed away because other things are more important. Unemployment benefits, healthcare, helping, the developing world and so on. And then at the end of the day, the defense minister is saying, but what about keeping up certain standards here? And that priority just comes at the very end, and I think that we reap very unfortunate benefit of that now. We need to catch up. The competitors have been doing it faster, better. There is also a question whether our procurement mechanisms are adapted to that. We're going to have more money in the system. Germany declared this 100 billion fund. Poland is ramping up defense spending to 3%. But, even Poland, because I'm from Poland, so that's the case that it's more familiar for me. The last procurements, the biggest defense acquisition have been done outside of the procurement system. Abrams tanks, F-35. If they want to buy it, they just bypass the procurement system. So I'm just worried at this point in time whether we do really understand geoeconomics, whether there is an acceptance. But we no longer can be so disassociated. The military dimension cannot be disassociated from the rest of our, economics lives, so to speak. And again, the other thing, whether the procurement mechanisms are, sufficiently adapted to deal with that potential resources which will be flowing back. But we have more interesting speaker here to address us. So I will stop here.
Thank you. They're extremely important remarks. But we have David van Weel, Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Threats of NATO. And how do you look at the report? And this is one big list of recommendations. And it was said before by our speakers that it's up to NATO to maybe make them into policies or not. So the floor is yours, David van Weel. Please communicate. Oh, okay. I'm really, really sorry. We haven't heard the beginning of your statement. You need to unmute yourself. Can you unmute yourself? Sorry, can you start again? Please communicate. Oh, okay. I'm really, really sorry. We haven't heard the beginning of your statement. You need to unmute yourself. Sorry, can you start again? Okay, I'm really, really sorry. We haven't heard the beginning of your statement. You need to unmute yourself. Okay, I think we're beginning to hear you. If you speak up, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I now hear an echo, but that doesn't bother me. If it doesn't bother you, then I'll start my intervention now. So what I was saying is thank you very much for the homework that you've given me. And it's not that I was shy for work.
I think we're beginning to hear you.
Challenges, but it is a very important line of work, and it's a new strand of work in a certain way. And I'll allude to why I think that that's the case. And in a new strand of work, you need powerful advocates. You need a lot of outside knowledge in order to be able to step up to the mark and to make sure that we win this race for technological innovation. So a lot of my speeches up until recently began with the words that the likelihood of a major conflict in Europe was not that big, and that most of the warfare would be in the grey domain under the threshold of Article 5. Now, of course, the chance of a major conflict in Europe is now exactly 1, and nobody would have predicted that we were here. But that doesn't mean that all the other threats below the threshold of Article 5 are not there. We are seeing a huge number of attacks in cyberspace, and I know you have Casper Klynge there. The report that Microsoft released is testimony to this. We are seeing the impact of the Turkish Bayraktar drones on the battlefield. We have seen Starlink being employed to fill the gap of communication that was caused by attacks by Russia. So innovation very much was, is, and will be key to winning wars on the ground. And the problem is that we have been disinvesting in research and development from a security and defense perspective, from a governance perspective in general, but from a defense perspective more specifically. The modern day innovations are no longer coming from the government, and at best we're late adapters, and at worst we're non-adapters. And I sometimes make the comparison that Amazon will most likely shortly deliver anything I want by drone to wherever I am with my mobile phone and make me pay for it once it's delivered. Whilst in the military, a lot of logistics planning is still happening with 10-ton diesel trucks and with Excel spreadsheets. So how do we come closer to where innovation happens, which is mostly in the commercial world? And I think the report gives us a lot of insights that we can use as we further mature the innovation system that we are trying to recreate within NATO through the means of DIANA, the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, and the NATO Innovation Fund. So those instruments have now been established. We have a charter for DIANA. We have a limited partnership agreement for the fund. But they are tools, and to use the tools, you need a very good understanding of the innovation ecosystems that you're venturing into, and where you're going to use these tools in order to become a player again. And I think there, the very extensive report by Globsec can help us a lot to define the long lines for the future. What does this geoeconomic competition look like? What is going to be our place as a security organization within the innovation ecosystem? What does it mean for the other players in that ecosystem? So I would like to keep it short, but say thank you very much for the work. I'm very, very sure, although we need to start negotiating on the strategic concept, that innovation, or in more specific, EDTs will find their way into strategic concept. They are a game changer for the way we do warfare, for our security and defense, for the values on which technology runs and which defines where we come from and where we're going. So rest assured that that will find its place, and more specifically within the Emerging Security Challenges Division, we will cherish your report and try to implement as much of the recommendations as we can as we move forward in our work on innovation. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this important input, and of course for the contribution and the willingness to look at the report and try to implement it into actual policies. All right, it's time now for question and answers, and I would like you to let me know whether you want to ask a question or make a short comment. And I know that much of this debate has been rather geeky sounding, but then again, you know, that's a bit the way debates work in the Brussels bubble. Don't be deterred from some of the geekiness. Ask whatever you would like, or make a short comment, and you can have this mic, yes, and please briefly present yourselves.
My name is Dmitry Shkruko, I'm National News Agency of Ukraine. I'm a journalist represented in here. Thank you so much for that excellent presentation, and especially about reflection of connection between security and geoeconomy. This is clear that there is the deep root for current conflict. For example, if you speaking about Russia, we see that underdeveloped country cannot simply stand the global competition, and that is exactly the reason why they are disturbing the global security and trying to destroy it to the dust. In that regard, I just want to ask how long the NATO, with all its technologies and innovations, could be avoiding that fight and this conflict with Russia, which is obviously unavoidable, because you maybe know very good that right now Russia is not fighting against Ukraine, they are fighting against NATO, and they are publicly stated that in their official statements. And another part of the question is if we are speaking about the result of that fight, how that result could be looking like, so that it's also an important question to answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that was to David van Weel, and then maybe to the other speakers as well. David?
The sound is really, really bad, so I didn't catch the question. Could you paraphrase it in maybe one sentence so I can...
The question is basically about the role of technology in the ongoing war of Russia against the West and against NATO. I mean, we've heard from Dmytro Shkulko from Ukrainian press that Russia thinks that this is a war between Russia and the West already, and NATO. So could you comment upon what lies ahead of us with a specific regard to technology and innovation?
Yes, I'll do that. I mentioned a few examples of the role that innovation is playing in this conflict. And I think that on the positive side, it's playing a role on the Ukrainian side. So whether it be through the help that we're giving them in the field of cyber defense, in the field of information gathering, information dissemination, or commercial endeavors like Starlink making available communication, or the involvement of more high-tech, low-cost drones in warfare. I think that we can see that in addition to more conventional warfare capabilities, innovation does make a difference. And it also does in what seems like to be a very conventional conflict on the ground now in Ukraine. we've also seen Ukraine making use of AI, facial recognition software, in trying to identify captured or killed Russian soldiers, etc., etc. So technology is very much there. Although if you look at the war footage that we get, then of course it is the enormous destruction. It is the stories of physical rape. It is the stories of people that are being killed in the most horrific, primitive way that gets the headlines at the moment. But for those of us like my division who are focused on the role of technology in warfare, this war is definitely also a tech war. And although we don't know the outcome yet, but we can already say that tech is playing a very, very important role for the Ukrainians in defending themselves against Russians. And it provides us with invaluable lessons on how to quickly bring new innovations into the field, how to use our involvement and contacts with the private sector in order to see what can be done in a very short time frame in order to bring new capabilities to bear. And we'll certainly pick up on those lessons.
To echo what you just said, David, I think it is important also in view of your question to keep in mind that innovation is key, but technology is only one element of innovation. This is really important to understand. I mean, there is this hype about technology going on, and everybody is looking for the next so-called disruptive technology. I mean, in the end, the kind of innovation we are advocating in this report brings together cultural change, conceptual change, organizational change, technological change, and operational experience. And these 5 lines of effort need to be brought together. So innovation really is about the long game. You might be looking into quick wins, but what we really need is a setup in which all 5 lines of effort are being taken care of. Not only pushing technology in the market, because technology that is not going to be accepted by armed forces will not make it in the market. So you need to take care of adaptation and acceptance of technology. And I think another element that is in a way a bit buried between the lines of your question, I think the new geoeconomic environment also puts new responsibility on governments in terms of what kind of investors they want to have in their defense industrial base. I mean, no, we had the discussion about Motor Sich being acquired by Chinese companies or by American companies, or in the end perhaps some European companies showing up as white riders and take them over. In the end, the Ukrainian government said, no, we're not going to sell Motor Sich to China. But I think that's exactly the kind of debate you need to engage also as a national government. Is every investor like every other investor? We have the FDI directive of the European Commission. This is the kind of debate that Casper also referred to, that NATO needs to engage in, because you need to have a very close public-private link to discuss these issues. Who knows what kind of investors currently own Western companies? The companies should know, but whether the governments know, whether the intelligence services know, I don't know. So that's one of the reasons why you need that close interaction between public and private sector companies in order to avoid the kind of sell-off of your industrial crown jewels to future adversaries.
If there's no, oh yes, here, take my mic.
Volker Heinecke, European Parliament. Mr. Van Weel, I've got a question. What do you think about NATO to also target an economic dimension, as mentioned in the report? It hasn't been really part of NATO politics in the past.
Moderator, to repeat the question, because the sound is still not very good. Apologies for that. We need some innovation here.
What do you think about NATO to target also an economic dimension, as mentioned in the report?
The economic dimensions, as mentioned in the report. Okay, let me give you a brief overview. I already mentioned that what we've done over the past decades, we've disinvested in research and development. So what we've done basically is we've led innovation to the market. And to be honest, it's led to great innovations. And still most patents are being deposited by universities that are on Allied territory. We still possess 9 out of the 10 top universities in the world. So there's nothing wrong with our innovation ecosystems. There's nothing wrong with our companies being able to commercialize on that. The problem is that we haven't been involved as governments. And there's a few problems with that. One of the problems is that it is very difficult now from a security perspective to engage with the economic sector and say, well, that's great that you've outsourced a lot of your production to China, but maybe in the long run, the security risks of this will mean that you have to come back. It's been difficult to tell telecom operators that although they were already building their systems, that all of a sudden they had to disuse ZTE and Huawei from certain parts of critical communication systems. So we're very late now to understanding technology, and that means that we can't really perform the role of regulator in general as governments. And from a security and defense perspective, we can't perform the role of looking at national security aspects of economic activities. And that is a gap that we need to close, because it's a gap that's already been closed on the Chinese and the Russian side. There's very much a national security view to whatever happens in the economic domain. And I don't think that we can stay away from that. Yes, we need to know that our critical infrastructure is in the hands of trusted investors. Yes, we need to know that our supply chains are redundant. We need to know that we have reliable supply chains. We need to know if we use artificial intelligence, what is behind it? Does it comply with our own values and norms that we bring to that technology? So I very much agree to being said it's not about developing technology, it's about developing understanding. It's developing mutual understanding between those developing technology and those in the security realm. It's about being able to regulate in a responsible way with knowledge. It's about creating trust with our own societies that we are trusted users. And it's about having a much closer connection between our economic activities and our security activities. We cannot see those two as two separate silos anymore.
David Herschenhorn.
Thanks so much, Roland. David Herschenhorn, journalist with Politico. For all the panelists, but especially Madam President, I wonder if you could talk about how you see NATO adapting and changing with the prospect of Finland and Sweden as members. What are the consequences for both NATO and for Russia with the prospect of the alliance's border with the Russian Federation doubling, obviously going directly against Putin's stated goal of reducing NATO's presence on his border? Thank you.
Well, open door policy remains NATO's policy. This is nothing new. It was part of the founding treaty back in 1949 with Article 10, providing for open door membership for those countries who satisfy the criteria. And of course, for any aspiring country, including Finland and Sweden, it's for them to take that decision whether they want to apply for NATO membership, and it's for NATO and NATO alone, NATO nations, to take the decision on their membership based on satisfying the criteria. What that means in the current situation, looking geopolitically, geostrategically at what President Putin wanted to achieve, and his manifesto back in 2000 of the restoration of Russian standing in the world and economic power, definitely he has weakened both Russia's standing in the world and Russia economically. One of the proclaimed reasons for this invasion was NATO expansion to the east, or NATO enlargement. To me, this is just creating space of security, stability, and democracy, what we call Europe whole, free, and at peace. And we've underlined so many times that NATO enlargement is not directed against Russia. We've had a relationship with Russia. However, that has fundamentally changed, and it now remains to be redefined in the NATO, in the next strategic concept, how we're going to manage that relationship with Russia. Of course, nobody wants to direct war. Our responsibility is to de-escalate and stop the war in Ukraine. But one of the results of this invasion was that the fact that NATO has actually increased its presence in its eastern members, with upending the number of forces, deployed forces, over 40,000. The fact that there's more aircraft in the air, more ships on the sea, more troops on the ground. And it has really reinforced our determination and on the application of Article 5. And I think that very, very clear messages have been sent to Russia that we will defend every inch of NATO's territory. So this has strengthened us in our resolve. It has acted as a catalyst overnight to take some decisions that had been for years in the making. We've bridged our differences that we had in terms of our common purpose. We've even bridged our differences in terms of contributions. All countries are contributing more. Now it's the issue of capabilities of what we've been talking about, of what we invest into. And I just hope that we remain united, not just within the Transatlantic Alliance, but within the European Union and globally in standing up against blatant violations of international law, of the principles of international law, and of aggression and war and territorial conquest, changing borders by force, and most notably of deliberately targeting and killing, shelling civilian population and imposing such horrible destruction upon any country.
Hi, Dylan Crossan from the Center for European Policy Studies. I was wondering, I haven't gone through the minutiae of the report, so this is potentially already mentioned, but listening to you, I think two parallel processes have kind of been absent. The Trade and Technology Council and the Transatlantic Defense Dialogue. And I was wondering to what extent your thinking has gone towards how to triangulate your proposals with these parallel processes, and maybe what type of, I don't know, if there should be a division of labor. Should NATO just be providing the strategic guidance on innovation and then letting that be dealt with on a bilateral level between the EU and the US? What type of format then comes out of this? Thank you.
It's an extremely good question that I think leads us into a 2-hour seminar on how we deal with that question across the Atlantic. We have it in the report. We have it in the report as a kind of issue to be discussed, because at the time of writing, the innovation agenda was in flux and TTC was in flux. But it clearly shows the difficulty of finding the right institutional format for the right question, because this is exactly what we said before. The more we look into the commercial technology world, the more you need to look into how commercial regulators, and TTC in a sense has a kind of dorming regulatory function, spills into the defense environment. And this is why we say NATO should have a voice in this discussion, because again the question is, what could be the added value? You might have the United States, you might have European NATO nations, but who in the end talks for allies? And who in the end takes care of a collective capability and a collective technology base. So that could be a role NATO could play. Of course, it would be interesting to hear what the Assistant Secretary General thinks about involving NATO in the TTC discussion. I think I would be a little bit more hesitant on this separation of tasks between the one actor providing strategic guidance, the other one implementing strategic guidance, because if you have that detachment, you exactly reinforce the existing problem. And that is that there might be too much top-down discussion and not enough real, tangible, operational outcome. And I think you need to bridge the two levels inside NATO, really inside NATO. And perhaps, and that's why we were talking about sandboxing, using sandboxing as one way also of informing the Commission's regulatory discussion, TTC discussion, and in the end, and then I stop, don't forget, geoeconomic competition is not only between NATO members and non-NATO members. Geoeconomic competition unravels inside NATO. So we have completely different views on regulating digital technology in Washington or over here in Brussels. So I think that's an angle. We only scratched the surface of that angle, but that's an issue that will be, I think, quite central for the way Diana is going to reach out to the various research centers, because if we don't get an understanding of how we approach these differences across the Atlantic, we're going to shoot ourselves in the knee.
Thank you so much. Extremely important debate. We have to be very brief now. Casper gets the floor for 30 seconds, the Assistant Secretary General for a last word, and then I have a concluding remark to make. Go ahead.
That's actually more difficult than writing the report, I think. No, listen, an excellent question. And as Heiko said, the TTC was actually also part of the discussions we had. I don't think there is any contradiction between the recommendations we're making in this report and the importance of the work of the TTC. And I think the transatlantic dimension of fostering a dialogue on new technologies based on democratic values, on fundamental rights, is exactly where both the European Union and the United States government as part of the TTC comes into play, and where some of the recommendations that we're making in this report of having NATO, be more vocal on these issues actually is very helpful from a slightly different starting point. And I think it shows both the momentum we have for transatlantic collaboration right now, but I think it also shows an increasing recognition that the technologies that we're developing for tomorrow needs to enter a phase where there is increased collaboration between democratic countries, in this case between countries on both sides of the Atlantic. 35 seconds?
That was pretty good.
Okay.
David van Weel.
I'll be just as short. I agree with the previous speakers on everything. What I would say is that the added value of NATO is that we have a very small lens through which we look at issues, which is the security and defense lens. So where the EU or the US at large needs to look at new technologies in all aspects, the advantage of NATO is that we can look at, for example, AI through a security and defense perspective. And that makes it easier to reach agreement on what we find acceptable and not acceptable for the use of AI, in this specific case, for the use of security and defense. So our AI strategy then becomes input, where all 30 allies agree on principles of responsible use, becomes input for the broad discussion that is to be had. And we aim to do so for all the technologies.
Of the question to end all questions for Madam President. There's one buzzword, very popular in this part of town, that hasn't been mentioned at all in this debate, and from the parts of the report that I have read, doesn't appear in the report. It's called European Strategic Autonomy. Can I have a comment on that?
Absolutely, yes. I don't see it contradictory to our concept at all. On the contrary, I think it's complementary. Speaking about strategic autonomy, it's often misunderstood. It's not just about defense, but many other aspects of foreign and security policy of the European Union. But, we've been saying for years that Europe needs to step up to the plate, to invest more, to We talked about smart defense at earlier times, but obviously there is need for the European side of the transatlantic alliance to do more. There is willingness now to do more. And I only see synergy between these two concepts. And as a matter of fact, we talk a lot about that in the adaptive portfolio on how we can combine forces, because after all, the membership of NATO and the membership of the EU overlap to a large degree. So we should not be putting this into a silo approach. We, on the contrary, should be talking about synergy on how we can do better together.
I think that's the best way to end this presentation, is the emphasis on synergies and combining forces between private and public, between the EU and its member states, NATO and its member states, and the EU and NATO, the two sides of the Atlantic. In all these respects, we need to combine forces to really create an innovative ecosystem and bring NATO forward in this field of innovation. And thank you again for contributing. Thank you for presenting. Thank you for being here. Thank you for discussing. And please stay tuned for further events by GlobSec in Brussels. Thank you very much. Feel free to grab a coffee or